spoils. So there's no reason to believe that first in, first out is appropriate. When he sells something, he's selling the more expensive one first, and the more expensive one he bought last. And so the more expensive one, which he bought last and therefore sold first, is LIFO. Well, what was the cost of what he had available to be sold? Well, he had two items that were available to be sold. One cost 5, one cost 8. The cost of everything that he had available to be sold was 13. The second question. Third question. Well, if he only had two items, one cost 5, the other cost 8, and if the cost of the item he sold was 8, then the cost of the item he did not sell, which is the cost of item left in inventory, is 5. Milk spoils, so that is almost always sold on a first in, first out basis. Yes, I know there is something called Pomalot, other brands that are in boxes, hermetically sealed, manufactured in a way that they don't spoil, but usually milk inventory, FIFO, first in, first out. And finally, you are selling milk. You are going to sell the oldest item first, and therefore your cost of goods sold expense is going to be the oldest item, or 5. And that concludes our quiz. Any questions about that? Okay, so quick comment about this quiz. Sometimes students express amazement if they didn't learn this topic sort of in a conceptual way, and they memorize their way through the chapter. And then if they hang in there, they get to a more advanced class and they are somewhat amazed at how simple. Well, I guess I shouldn't say simple because nothing is ever truly simple. How straightforward, that's a better word, how straightforward the subject matter is. Accounting is generally straightforward because it's meant to be a pragmatic discipline with tools that need to be used in the business place. And so, and this is certainly true as you move forward into 3368, when things start to get a little bit more complicated, but it's also true in this class. The measurement guideline that you should use, for want of a better word, in trying to figure out whether or not you understand something, truly understand it in accounting, is whether or not it makes a fundamental amount of common sense in a pragmatic way. I've sort of said that in the past, but this is such a textbook, no pun intended, textbook example of that. I wanted to mention it again. Accounting is meant to be pragmatic and straightforward. And if it just doesn't seem that way, if it seems like something that you simply have to memorize to get or to master, then it simply means that it hasn't yet been presented to you, in a manner that's appropriate, or maybe you just haven't had a moment to sit down and walk through it in a pragmatic frame of mind. So anyway, just wanted to pass that along to you. Any questions at all about LIFO, FIFO, etc., before, or about the quiz before we jump into the new material for the day? And okay, so let me go ahead and share screen again. Okay. There we go. And we are sharing screen. Okay, you should see the textbook on your screen now with the usual little documents from Canvas in the upper right-hand corner. If you remember, we had a couple of items in Chapter 8 that I'll discuss briefly. It's Part B, LIFO simplification. I only want to spend a tiny bit of time on this. Let me click back to it, because these are not designed to be methods that you should ever really use. When the textbook author calls them simplification methods, what he's really saying is, if you want to cut corners and do something in a way that seems less time consuming, these are the things that people will do, even though they know they really shouldn't. Why did they ever do it? Well, because in the very, very old days of accounting, pre-computers, accounting just took so long when it was all manual that people had no choice but to look for shortcuts. Now, if you have a very lengthy process in the world of accounting, the thing to do is not find a shortcut, cut corners. The thing to do is use computer systems, to do the repetitive arithmetic work for you. Still, you'll sometimes see people refer to these, and so I just wanted to briefly review them with you. The first issue is something called inventory pools. Now, in the case of inventory pools, you really have three different types of inventory. And what you see on the screen, you're a lumber company, you are selling wood panels, and you have three different general ledger accounts: pine, oak, and maple. And you should have them on your books as three different accounts, three different T accounts, or three different columns on your data set or database. And as you can see, they all go for different costs per foot because they're different types of inventory, ranging from $2.20 to $3 per foot. Well, if the weighted average of everything in inventory is precisely $2.47, and if you wanted to use a shortcut to make your life simpler, could you simply say, instead of three different types of wood with three different costs, because they really are three different inventory items, could you just dump them all into one general ledger account, just call them wood, and just assume that each plank of wood costs $2.47, which is the average of the three? I mean, you could, but you really shouldn't. But under this inventory pool approach, you do. And so here, you just assume that you have 40,000 planks of wood. You think of it as one inventory item, and you just operate your general ledger as if each item cost you approximately 247. Where'd you get the 247? Well, it's the average of what all of the inventory actually cost you. Okay, questions about that? Okay, now dollar value LIFO is just as quick and dirty. And as you can see here, I mentioned in the handout the step 3 table. Well, if you look at the step 3 table, basically you spent $400,000 prior to January 1st, 2024, meaning last year, buying an inventory. Every time you buy a new order of inventory, if the costs of the new inventory are different than the cost to you of the old inventory, you account for the cost separately or differently. I mean, that's the point of doing LIFO and FIFO. Let's say that the cost jumped 5% in January of 2024, and then it's sort of hovered around 5% all year. Sometimes it went up by an extra percent, sometimes it went down by 2%, then it bounced up by an extra percent. Generally speaking, though, let's assume for the time being that the costs did bounce around all year when you made several purchases throughout the year. But roughly, you spent about 5% more this year than you did last year. Okay, can you just assume that everything that you bought this year has a cost of exactly 5% more than what you spent last year? Well, you really shouldn't. That would be a simplification or a cutting corners approach. And that's what the author means by dollar value LIFO or dollar value inventory method. It is a simplification, meaning it is a cutting corners. It is a time-saving gesture, and in an era of computers, it's probably completely unnecessary. Okay, questions about that? Okay. So on to chapter 9. Chapter 9 has an interesting title. Chapter 9 is called More Inventories, Additional Issues. Now, what do they mean by additional issues? Well, the author means these are just odds and ends. Okay, this is not nearly as important as the 5 equations. You remember the clay pot, manufacturing process, the work in process, the finished goods, all of that. That's important stuff. And actually, FIFO versus LIFO is also important stuff. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that this is completely unimportant, but I guess I could say that everything that we encounter in this chapter is sufficiently unimportant to be dumped into a chapter called Additional Issues. Stuff that does not really merit its own chapter or even its own major section within a chapter. Okay. So we have 4, and I just opened our notes. I've already preemptively yellow highlighted what I think I will cover on the next quiz. And actually what I should do as well, let me go back to chapter 8, unhighlight what will no longer be on the quiz and highlight what we just reviewed for the next quiz. Shafai, go right ahead.
I might have to leave the class early today. Would I have a recording for it?
Unfortunately, I don't record the sessions. I don't record the sessions, so I am very sorry about that. It's not that I want to deny you our recording, it's just that we have no recording. At least not, not on my side, not officially. Okay, so let me save chapter 8. Now, generally speaking, we have 4 different parts or 4 different topics, A, B, C, D. See that on the right side of your screen. However, part C is more dollar value LIFO. We basically talked about that already. We just did a few minutes ago. It's an estimation method that generally is not needed because it's designed to be a shortcut, and now people use computers instead of going through a shortcut process. I am going to cover all of part A. That's pretty important, well, relatively speaking, for this chapter. I am going to cover the first 3 illustrations or the first 2 lines in part B. And I think what you'll find is that when we get to the last item in what we're covering in Pod B, we're going to see something that the textbook author simply returns to over and over and over again. So I might go ahead and look at the beginning of illustration 9-9, but I'm not going to spend much time at all on 9-9, 9-10, and again, 14, 14A, 14B. For Pod D, which is all about adjustment entries, I'll review 16 and 19. 9-20, I think, is self-explanatory. And so if all goes well, that won't be quizzable for our next quiz this Thursday. In any event, that's a long-winded way of saying this is why I yellow highlighted the ones that I yellow highlighted for this chapter. We might be able to get through this chapter awfully quick, not that much to talk about, and save more time to dig into what I think are denser subjects later in the semester. Okay, so that's my intro to chapter 9. Any questions about the purpose of the chapter, the nature of it as sort of a catch-all of odds and ends? Okay, so subsequent measurement of inventory. Why is this needed? This is needed because, at least for certain types of inventory, the store buys inventory to resell and then realizes often that there's just no demand for it. Now, there are certain types of inventory that do not go up and down in demand because of consumer preference. They're staples. You know, they are, for instance, let's say a simple work bag, kind of bag that you need to put things in to take to work. Well, I guess there are certain bags that are highly fashionable and go in and out of fashion often, but there are other work bags that don't go in and out of fashion at all. They are truly utilitarian. So you might say, okay, they don't go in or out of fashion if you buy one of those bags as a store and you don't sell it right away. You could just hold on to it until people eventually buy it. Well, that's not always necessarily true. Sometimes you buy a bag for resale, and as a store, it costs you $10, and you think you're going to be able to sell it for 12. But then a pandemic hits, and you realize it could be years before you ever sell it, and you decide you might just have to give it to a liquidator and basically have the liquidator pay you a fraction of what you originally paid for it. In other words, even though people will often think of markdowns or reductions in the value of inventory being a matter of the inventory is just not demanded as much, it goes out of fashion. You also have other business reasons why you might buy inventory for resale. Assuming that you'll be able to sell it at a profit, only to your consternation or even horror, realizing that it's now only worth a fraction of what you originally paid for it. What are you supposed to do as an accountant for a store, for a retailer, if you have inventory that the store originally bought? Of course, when you bought it, you reduced cash and increased inventory by the amount that you paid for it, by its cost to you. Well, what are you supposed to do when, for one reason or another, the cost of the inventory, or the value, I should say, plummets, and it's not going to bounce back quickly. The value of the inventory to you has declined, and therefore you should reduce the value of the inventory to what it is now worth. Now, we see that in the right-hand column of Exhibit 9-1. Whether we use measurement approach 1 or measurement approach 2, and I'll get into their differences in a moment, as you can see in the far right column, we're reducing the value of the inventory. The value of an asset goes down, meaning we have an expense because the value of the company has gone down. And therefore, if we have an expense because the value of the company goes down, net income will go down as well. Okay. The two measurement approaches are basically doing the same thing. The concept of the two measurement approaches is if the value of what you bought has significantly declined below what you paid for it, then you need to reduce the value of what you bought, the asset called inventory, to what it is now worth. Measurement approach number 1 says what it is now worth is whatever a customer will pay you for it, net realizable value. Measurement number 2 says what an item is now worth is whatever a customer in the market will pay you for it. What's the difference between net realizable value, meaning what a customer in the market will pay you for it, and the word market, which represents what a customer in the market will pay you for it? There are different ways in which you can try to quantify that thought. And basically what you should really do is select the way that can give you a more accurate estimate of what a customer will pay. Now, how do you actually do that? That would be illustration 9-2. Nine 2 says, okay, this is how you think about lower of cost or net realizable value. You have 5 different items in inventory, A, B, C, D, E. Each one has a cost. A and B are part of the same category of inventory. C, D, E, they're all part of a different category of inventory. So you have 5 different inventory items grouped into 2 different categories of inventory, and the 5 items and the 2 groups or categories taken together, that is your total inventory. And what this illustration is attempting to show you is, depending on whether or not you are thinking of these items by individual item, or by category, or by total inventory, the calculation of lower of cost or net realizable value, NRV, which is saying the same thing as saying, generally speaking, the value of your inventory is cost, except when something happens in the market. And what your customers will pay you is significantly less than cost. That's what it means. Well, here's cost in the left column. Here's net realizable value. As you can see, if you compute lower of cost or market, which is here called lower of cost or net realizable value, if you do that on an item by item basis and add up the values of the 5 inventory items, the value of your inventory is $395. However, if you compare total cost to total market value on a category by category basis, the total value of your inventory is 406. And finally, if you say, I'm not going to deal with individual items or categories, I'm just going to add up the cost of all my inventory, compare it to the value of all my inventory, the market value, and the lower of the two is what my inventory is worth. Depending on whether you measure inventory value by individual item, by category, or by total inventory, you could conceivably come up with a different overall value number for total inventory. And I think the textbook author actually does a pretty nice, takes a pretty decent approach to quantifying that. Now, you might have another question. Question being, why would you think of your inventory on an item by item basis versus when would you think of your inventory by category or in total? Well, certainly if you're only selling one type of inventory, then you have no choice but to compute lower of cost or market in total. But let's say you have 5 different items. If the 5 different items are almost identical to each other, then you might say they're also similar to each other. I might as well think of them as one total inventory as opposed to 5 different items. Okay, what do I mean by very similar to each other? Let's say you are selling little sponges that people can use to wash dishes by hand. Little sponges that people use to wash dishes by hand. Let's say some of your sponges are blue and some of your sponges are red. If they're virtually identical, if the blue sponge coloring liquid at the manufacturer's level is pretty much the same as the red sponge coloring liquid, if the process that you take to color a sponge blue is exactly the same as the process that you take to color a sponge red, if the sponge liquid color vendor who sells you the blue liquid, you know, what you use to color a sponge blue, is also the same one as the vendor who sells you the red liquid, and if the cost of the 2 different color liquids are, again, everything absolutely identical right down the line, then you can see someone say, for purposes of keeping track of inventory values, I'm just going to think of them as sponges, not as blue sponges and red sponges. And so that would be going to total inventory, the column on the right, as opposed to individual sponges, the column on the left. The column in the middle is somewhere in between. So you might say, hey, I sell utensils, you know, kitchen utensils, dining utensils, forks and knives and spoons. And let's say they're all made out of plastic. A fork that is plastic, a knife that is plastic, and a spoon that is plastic. Those are different than each other, let's say. Let's say you need to use a different type of plastic molding machine to mold out a plastic knife as opposed to a plastic fork. And so you're using different machines. The machines might cost different amounts of money. The machines might have different patterns in terms of how often they break down. The machine that makes little plastic forks might need to be sharpened more often because the little plastic forks have those little prongs, the fork prongs, and the fork, no one likes a blunt fork. Whereas with a spoon, it's okay if the spoon is blunt because you're not trying to stab any food with the spoon. And so you might get to a point where you're actually using different machines to produce plastic forks than plastic spoons or plastic knives. Now, you might still produce blue plastic knives and red plastic knives. And so it's possible that you might have in your plastic dining utensil factory 6 different items: blue spoons, red spoons. No, let me go the other way. 6 different items: blue spoons, blue forks, blue knives. Different. And 3 more different items: red spoons, red forks, red knives. So you have 6 different items, 3 different types of utensil, 2 different colors, 6 items in total. You might have 3 different categories of inventory: the fork, the knife, the spoon. Each category having 2 items within it, 2 different colors. There you might say, I think in terms of how I keep my inventory, I should keep it by category because I'm using different machines and they're very different and they cost different amounts of money to operate by category. But once I'm within a category, the only difference between 2 different items is its color, and the cost and the process and the demand for each color is pretty much the same. Any questions about this illustration, 9-2? Andrew, go right ahead.
So in looking at the illustration, I'm a little confused on the math. So it seems that by individual items, the net realizable value was taken from the cost, but not the NRV, whereas for C, D, and E, it was taken from the NRV. So
Okay, so let me jump in. First of all, keep in mind the cost column on the far left is what you spent to buy the inventory to begin with. The NRV is what a customer will pay you for it. And so and then on the right, the 3 columns on the right say, okay, the way that you should account for the inventory on your books, when you first buy it, then its value is what you spent for it. Its value is its cost to you. But if, doesn't happen all the time, but if what a customer will pay for it actually drops below what you spent for it to begin with, which means that if you sell it, you're going to lose money. Then you have a reduction in the value of your asset that is serious, because in a well-run store, that does not happen. I mean, the whole idea of being a store is you're supposed to make a profit when you sell something for more than what you bought it for. It should not be the other way around. And so the two columns on the left are measured independently of each other. And then for the three columns on the right, and you would never actually compute all three columns on the right at once. You would pick the column of those three columns that best reflects the type of inventory that you actually have on hand. And then for that column, compute the lower of cost to market. Hey, Andrew, was that helpful?
Yes, thank you. It also looks like you just calculate both the cost and the NRV and then take the lower of the two, depending on whichever type of category you're using, whether it's individual, total inventory, or category.
That's true. Or total inventory on the far right, which is just a single number. That's true, although, and I'm just going to nitpick over the word. When you said calculate cost or calculate NRV, it's not always in the real world a calculation. You know, in terms of cost, you tell the manufacturer, I'm a store and I want to buy this so I can resell it. And the manufacturer says, well, pay me this and I'll sell it to you. And so whatever the price quote is that you have to pay is your cost. It's not so much that you are calculating the cost, it's that it is whatever you happen to spend for it. Same thing with net realizable value. Net realizable value is how much you can get for the item that you just bought from your customer. And you might have a very complicated process with all kinds of calculations to figure out what you're going to charge the customer. Or it could be something as simple as, hey, you know, I'm selling sticks of bubble gum. I think people will pay $1.25 per stick today. And so that's what I'm going to charge today. And so it may not be the cost and NRV columns, may not be calculations per se. They may simply be what a company finds it has to pay or what it can charge in the market. Okay. Okay. So next up, there is an adjusting cost to NRV or net realizable journal entry. And I think it's a simple one. And I usually don't like to use the word simple, but here I will. Let's say because the value of certain inventory items have dropped below their asset value or their cost, you need to reduce the asset value to what it is now worth. Okay. Reduce the asset inventory, in this case, by $20,000. Well, when you reduce an asset, you reduce the value of the firm. That is an expense. And so the author happens to call that expense cost of goods sold expense, but it could easily be called inventory write down expense or some other type of name. Okay, now as we go on, we'll simply see sort of a couple of different variations on this theme. So before I go on, any questions about this? Tam, go right ahead.
Yeah, can I ask about the total of by the territory? I don't know how can we calculate the 406,000 with that?
The 406, okay, sure. So remember, there are basically 10 numbers that are given. They are the 5 costs of the 5 inventory items,
Yeah.
the 50, the 100, the 80, the 90, and the 95, and the 5 market values, what customers will pay you for the 5 items. 85, 90, 75, 85, and 96. So those 10 numbers are essentially given. The costs come out off of your general ledger. What you can get when you sell your inventory, the net realizable value, is your best guess at any given moment. The way that you compute the 406 is as follows. If you believe that the most meaningful way to do accounting for your inventory is to think of your inventory as two different categories, in the same way that in my example of utensils, I thought of forks, spoons, and knives as three different categories. Here we have two different categories. Well, if the total cost of this category is 150, and the total the total market value of this category is 175, then what it means is you originally spent 150 to buy this inventory. It's actually worth more than 150. So there's certainly no need to reduce the value of the inventory. Just leave it at what you originally spent for it. What's happening here for this category of inventory? Well, you originally spent $265 for it. So it's currently on your books as an asset valued at $265. Uh-oh. You can only get $256 if you were to sell it right now. Meaning the market value of that item is significantly below what you thought it would be. Because if you spent $265 to buy it to begin with, you must have assumed, usually, that you would get more than $265 for it. But the market value, what you can get for it at the moment, is actually $256, below $265. Then you have to reduce its value from $265 down to $256 on a category by category basis. The value of the inventory after reducing the value of a category to what you can sell it for, if the latter number is less than the first number, is 406.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sure. Okay, so what happens? Again, you wind up with a simple journal entry that looks like that. Reduce inventory if you must. Recognize an expense if you do. Now, what happens next, at least in the textbook, as we move on to 9-3, instead of calling this lower of cost or net realizable value, the textbook author just comes up with a more complicated way of getting to the same point. And so I'll walk you through this. I do want you to understand the logic. But please keep in mind, this is just a more complicated way of saying, usually the cost of inventory for a store is what it spent for it. However, if what you can get for it from the market is less than what you spent for it, you should reduce the value of the asset. So how does the textbook author accomplish that? Well, textbook author says, okay, I have item A in inventory. If we look down at it's not the most easily formatted illustrations in terms of being able to follow what's going on It's always unfortunate when I have to begin by saying, look at the bottom half of the illustration first. But do that and look at item A. You bought an inventory item for $50,000. How much can you get for it in the open market? Well, it depends. Do you mean when you say, what can I get for it in the open market? Do you mean if I buy it from a supplier, like my supplier, who knows me well and trusts me and is willing to give me a really good price? Okay, sure. Well, then if my $50,000 inventory item is sold or destroyed in a hurricane, and if I need to replace it immediately, the market value from my own supplier who knows me well would be 55,000. Okay, well, under the common lower of cost or market value calculation, we would say the market value exceeds cost, keep the value at cost. However, the textbook author says, let's throw in a couple more numbers here. Why? Well, let's say that I was actually selling this for 100. It cost me 50 to buy, and I've been selling it for 100. So instead of saying the market value is 55, because that's how much my supplier would charge me, given our really friendly relationship, the market value from the perspective of the customers of mine, who I'm obviously ripping off, is 100. That's what they're paying me for something that's only costing me 50. Now, hold on, you might say, I have to pay $15,000 in selling costs. Meaning, for instance, I might have to pay for shipping to sell the product to the customer. So please don't tell me that I'm ripping off the customer by selling the customer something for 100, which only costs me 50. If I have to pay $15,000 just to ship the item to the customer, then my sales price that I get to keep after paying the shipping is only 85. Okay. In addition, my investors expect me to earn 20% of the selling price as profit. Maybe that's the dollar amount that I've promised to pay my investors as dividends. Well, okay. So if the selling price is 100 and I'm only keeping 85 of it because I have to pay for shipping 15,000, and I am forced to earn a profit of 20% and perhaps turn around and pay it as a dividend to my investors. I promised them that. Then in a way, when I get the 100,000, which is the market value, it's what my customers pay me, and after I finish paying the shipping, the estimated selling cost, and after I make a profit, but one that I've targeted for some other purpose, so I'm going to have to spend it somewhere, then I really don't think of the amount of money that I'm going to get by selling this product as 100. I actually think of it as 65. And so in a way, the amount of money that I get to keep from a customer when I sell this, again, the gross amount is 100. But that market value that I get to keep is only 65. Phew. I actually have a number of different market values in this situation. I have what my own supplier will give me. It's usually a friendly number, but not always. In this case, it is a friendly number. It's only 55. It's the market value, meaning what I would collect from my customer, after I pay estimated selling expenses. And then there's the amount that I would receive from the customer after paying selling expenses and any profit margin that is targeted or earmarked for someone specific. Well, then, is the market value that I compare to the cost for purposes of deciding whether to write down the cost? Is it the replacement cost? Is it the 85? The selling price minus selling expenses? Or is it the 65, which is the 85 minus the targeted profit number? And the textbook, and when I first noticed this, I kind of smiled. The textbook author in column 5 just sort of tossed his hands up in the air and said, "Oh, I don't know. Let's just look at those three numbers and literally pick the middle one." Kind of like a compromise. And if, now that doesn't sound very scientific, and it's not. I've seen other people say maybe you should take the average of these three numbers. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to say, which of the, determine which of these numbers or some number in between is the market value. But the bottom line is, if you're going to throw your hands up in the air and say, let's just pick the middle one, then the middle one for item A is 65. And then you do say, okay, my cost is 50. The market value that I am selecting to compare to cost is more than 50. So we'll keep the value of the asset at the lower of the two, or 50. Okay, questions about that? It's really no different conceptually than the previous example, except for the fact that the decision that you have to make about, well, what exactly do I mean by the value that my customers will actually pay me for the asset? You have different ways of defining that. This is one way of defining it. Now, the textbook author calls this way the lower of cost or market way, as opposed to lower of cost or net realizable value. I've seen different names applied to these methods. And again, I've seen different methods. I often see one where the three different possibilities for defining market value are simply averaged, and they use all kinds of different names of them. So please don't necessarily get hung up on what the textbook author calls these different methods. I mean, the names are valid, but it's not like they're engraved in stone. Okay, so let me pause. Let me ask any questions about this. Okay, Bob, go right ahead.
Okay, Professor, about the number 5, the market middle of 2, 3, and 4, how are we supposed to pick, like if we're to pick the middle of 2, 3, and 4, it would be 3, isn't it? Like the 85?
Oh, when I say middle, I mean the number that is the second largest of the three. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, you're right.
Right. Got it.
Column 3 is physically in the middle, but column 5, when we say middle, or when the textbook author says middle, he means think of them, line up those three numbers from lowest to highest and pick the one that is in the middle from a value perspective.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, now strangely, we go on to illustration 9-4. There is literally, in terms of approach, no difference whatsoever between this and -2. Okay, you're just looking at different ways of defining the word market. And yeah, it's true that if you define market in a more complicated way, some of your market numbers may wind up to be a little bit different than they were before. But you're still defining what your individual inventory items are. If you have categories, you need to define what they are. You are looking at the nature of those inventory items and you're deciding whether it's more appropriate to think about them individually or by category or in total. And whichever approach you take, you look at the cost of that inventory, you look at the overall market, however you're defining it, and if the cost is less than market, which is normal for a retailer, you want your cost to be less than market because you want to make a profit when you sell the item, then there's no journal entry at all. It's just normal. However, if the market has fallen below cost, then that's a problem. That should never really happen, and you reduce cost to market. What I just said for 9-4 is exactly what I said for 9-2. The only difference is the textbook author is using in 9-4 the more complicated way of defining market value. Questions about that? Okay, so 9-5. We're now into Pod B. Now, keep in mind, Pod B is called estimation techniques. Just like at the end of chapter 8, remember, we had something called simplification. This is estimation. Whenever you see words like simplification or estimation, it probably means that the accountant is trying to cut corners a bit, because doing it right in its entirety is just going to take an awful lot of time. And although this is not always true, it is often true that when that happens, the cutting corners approach that you see described might be obsolete because we don't really need to spend huge amounts of time on approaches that require cutting corners to make them more time effective, because we just have computers do the work for us. Still, retail inventory techniques, okay, Pod B begins with this method, the gross profit method. And I just realized, okay, don't panic, not a big deal, but illustration 9-5 is, I believe, actually part of Part B. Let me check them. Yes. So I am just going to move 9-5 to Pod B on my notes. Okay, so what is 9-5? And by the way, I will review 9-5 and then we'll call it a day. And so just to make sure that we are clear on what is being quizzed or not quizzed, let me unyellow everything that will not be on the next quiz. In other words, we'll complete 9-5 right now. What will be on the next quiz this Thursday? Part B, LIFO simplification, just the brief amount of information that we reviewed from the last chapter earlier in this session, and the items that I yellowed right here. Okay. So this is how this method works. Remember, it's an estimation or simplification method, meaning you probably shouldn't be doing it. But to understand it, how much is my inventory worth? What inventory? The inventory that's still there at the end of the day. Oh, I don't know. I should check my records, but my records are in lousy shape. Okay, can I estimate what my ending inventory is worth? Well, you can estimate anything if you cut enough corners. Do you at least know what your inventory was worth at the beginning of the day? Yes, it's just that today was a messy day, records-wise. Okay. What was your beginning inventory actually worth at the beginning of the day? 600. And you did buy some additional material today, didn't you? Yes. And I just paid for it today because I just received it today. So then I should be able to give you an actual number as well. I bought $1.5 million worth of inventory today for resale. Well, if at the beginning of the day you had $600,000 worth of inventory, and if you paid for an extra 1.5 million of inventory that you received today, then your goods that were available for sale today, $2.1 million worth of inventory. Okay. Do you know how much you got from your customer when you sold them your inventory today? Actually, I can figure that number out because I have a cash register. And so I'll just go to my cash register and ask the cash register, so to speak, how much cash did I collect today when I sold my inventory today? $2 million worth. Okay. Usually, what is your gross profit percentage? Roughly. Well, the gross profit percentage means how much profit I earn on every item of inventory that I sell. Well, generally speaking, on average, my gross profit percentage is 40%. And that means that when I sell $2 million worth of inventory, and when I say when I sell, I mean what I charge customers, what my customers pay me is $2 million. When I get the customers $2 million, $800,000 of what they give me is just pure profit. Because on average, 60% of what they pay me is what I had to pay to buy the item of inventory to begin with. Now, where does the 40% and the 60% come from? These percentages, as you can see here, are themselves just estimates. They're guesses. So you say, okay, let me get this straight. At the beginning of today, the value of the inventory asset that was available for sale, $2.1 million. You also happen to know that according to your sales register, your cash register, you collected $2 million from your customers today. 40% of whatever you collect is usually pure profit, which means that 60% of whatever you collect on average is usually the cost of goods sold. It's whatever you paid to buy the stuff that you sold for 2 million. Well, if you had 2.1 million available for sale, and if you think that you sold 1.2 million of what was available for sale, then the amount of inventory unsold at the end of the day, you wanted to sell it, but you couldn't find the customer. So this is the remaining asset, inventory, unsold at the end of the day, hopefully to be sold tomorrow, is the remaining 900,000. Where is the estimate? It's really here. If you know how much inventory you started the day with, if you know how much money you paid the supplier of the inventory, if you know how much money your customers paid you today to buy stuff from you, the one additional number that is actually an estimate is out of every dollar that you get from your customer, roughly, estimate-wise, how much is profit and how much is the cost to buy the item to begin with. That's the one estimate here, and you can use it to back into the value of your inventory that is still unsold at the end of the day. That is called the gross profit method because the only estimation, the only guess, is your gross profit percentage. Allow me to say, just to reemphasize, we'll stop here in terms of what's on the quiz, but as we look through the remainder of parts B and C on Thursday after our quiz, in a way, to a certain extent, we'll just see more complicated versions of this basic approach. Okay, questions? Any questions about this? Any questions at all? By the way, the reason why I say these, and in particular, this type of method is no longer needed, is because we no longer have to guess at what our ending inventory is worth. Every item that is available for sale has its own little tag. And when a customer buys it, you just wave the wand over the tag and the systems update the actual sale. And so there's no need to estimate, you know, the value of what you sold versus the value of what's still available for sale. The last time that I went to HEB and walked through the fruit section, each individual apple, some apples were being sold in bags, other apples were being sold loose. Even the apples that were being sold loose, each apple had its own little tag, its own little sticker, and would be put through the, the sales register, and the guy standing there would beep each individual apple. And so if certain apples were bought from one apple orchard and cost 40 cents an apple, and other apples were bought from a different apple orchard and cost 42 cents an apple, it doesn't take HEB much time and effort now that it has modern systems to know exactly the value of the apples that were sold and the value of the apples that are unsold and remaining in ending inventory. Okay, questions? I will hang back as always to answer individual questions, but for group questions, let me say going once and going twice And okay, guys, once again, I hope you had a wonderful Valentine's Day. Welcome back to a perfectly normal week. I will see you on Thursday.